So the Majority Report, not too long ago, had AOC on for an interview. And Emma and Sam did a brief interview with her. They talked about the recent vote for Democratic Party leadership, a leadership position within the Democratic Congress that she was up for, a vote which she lost. And they also talked about, Elon Musk swaying the Republicans in Congress and sort of negotiating with them publicly via Twitter and all the weird stuff that was going on there. So, they talked about essentially the machinations of Congress at that moment and a little bit in terms of strategy going forward. What is the left? What are progressives going to do? So there has been some people that have said that AOC, essentially AOC is a lost cause at this point, or that she represents the establishment because of some of her voting patterns, because of the fact that she has not held up to the standard that she sort of set for herself in terms of how she was going to behave as a congressperson. She sold herself as a very disruptive type of force in Congress that would apply pressure, apply force anywhere she could at all times in order to fight for people. And so that's sort of what people voted for. And even if you're outside of her jurisdiction and couldn't vote for her, that's what people supported about her and how she was able to build this large network of people who want to donate and support her publicly and that sort of thing. And so there are people like that, people within that demographic of people that, have become disillusioned and disappointed with her, I think, for valid reason. And so I've seen some people saying that Sam and the Majority Report should not be having AOC on because, essentially she represents the establishment, and that it's a reflection of the fact that Sam and the Majority Report represent the establishment, which is, it's a certain argument. It's not so much what I want to tackle in this video. Like I said in a previous video about Cenk Uygur versus Sam Seder, I think the establishment versus populist sort of metric is kind of stupid. And I mean, it's super valid to point at the Democratic establishment and say, these people who are trading stocks, these people who are sabotaging the left or any type of progressive policy at every opportunity because they want to do the same thing that Republicans want to do and essentially protect the rich, protect wealthy business interests within their constituencies and beyond. And, it's fair to point at those people and say that these are not our allies as people who want left-wing and progressive policy to actually be passed and actually be the law of the land. And Democrats oftentimes really just get in the way of stuff like that. They do a really excellent job of getting in the way of any form of left-wing or progressive policy. So I think it's valid to be skeptical of a politician like AOC or of even the Majority Report, because they've taken a pretty unabashed position that given the current political climate, you should vote for Democrats. And I think, honestly, for the most part, that's true. Now, Bernie has also come out and said that we need to vote for independents and run independents anywhere that we can to try to make it so that there are more independents and potentially left-wing Congress members in all positions in Congress, in the Senate, etc. And that's all well and good, but doesn't exactly sound like a super robust plan to get third parties and different types of entities to be actually viable electorally. Doesn't really seem like a pathway to that. Or if it is, it's a very long-term pathway. So if we're talking about voting in terms of this is the person who I love the most and I support, and this is my favorite politician, this politician is my hero who's going to save me, then yeah, voting is stupid and dumb and you shouldn't vote for Democrats, if that's what voting is. But that's not really what voting is. Voting is it's something that you can do to materially affect the conditions of society, even if it's incremental. Because if the organization that you're going to do behind the scenes or in between election seasons, I should say, if it's going to be the same organizing no matter who's in leadership, you can also recognize that if Democrats create conditions that are incrementally better, that makes organizing potentially exponentially easier. And I think the best example of that is with the labor movement. I mean, with as much of a disappointment and in many ways a failure as Joe Biden's presidency has been, he has allowed an enormous amount of breathing room for the labor movement, and there's been a ton of momentum there. And to be honest with you, I don't know what's going to happen to that under the leadership of Trump. I think that's going to be one of the number one, or maybe one of the earliest material effects of Trump. It's going to be one of their first priorities is cracking down on the labor movement. So in that case, while Biden does do things like break railway strikes and stuff, and he's not necessarily 100% in the corner of unions every time, as he might like people to believe. Still, Democrats in the last 4 years, among a handful of other things, have succeeded in creating a favorable environment for labor. And AOC in her rhetoric seems to be focusing more on that. There's a little bit of a movement from the intersectional language of 4 to 6 years ago that was popular to a more working class, sort of broad economics-based type of message, trying to appeal to people in the middle of the scale economically in America. So there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about the Democratic Party. If people like AOC can push it in the direction of being a more labor-focused party, that's a good thing. As for whether AOC stands in a position to be able to do that, I don't know. I mean, we're in a position now where even the progressive bloc of Congress that was the Squad seems to have been effectively disorganized at this point. You still have figures like Rashida Tlaib, who I believe is holding strong in Michigan, and I think her constituents like her a lot. So even though she's been kind of shunned by Congress, I don't necessarily think she's going anywhere either. And so there's still potential for the progressive coalition in Congress to build, especially in the midterm elections. We'll see what happens. But it's not looking great right now. And I guess the question that I'm really focusing on here is it for somebody in the position of Sam Seder, does it make sense to platform a person like AOC, give her sort of softball interviews? I don't think the issue is so much platforming her, but it was kind of a softball interview that they did. And I don't know that this is the time to be being too soft on AOC, except for the fact that they're clearly trying to build a coalition there. Now, AOC lost this important vote in the House and then immediately pivots back to her more progressive base and, makes an appeal to the sort of progressive audience of the Majority Report. I think partially because she realized, look, I'm not getting the support from the establishment of the Democrats. I made a shot for it, but I don't have that. So I've got to go back to square one, so to speak. And I think what this reminds me of is being in the music industry, and let's say when labels show interest in artists, it's has very little to do with your talent, or in this metaphor, we'll say like how good your ideas are. Very little to do with that. You can have really good ideas. Maybe even you have some good starts to some of those ideas. That's not really what the label is looking for. What the label is looking for is an audience. They want you to have your audience already. And when you have that audience, that is when you have something to work with. And not only are they going to be more excited to work with you, but you actually start to have the ability to dictate some of the terms. Because at the end of the day, every label is looking for an audience. They are looking for ways to try to reach people because they're not that good at doing it themselves. And so they really expect artists to do it themselves, which you can do now because of the internet. So now that you can do that, they don't tend to want to spend their money doing it themselves when they could just sign artists who have already found their own audience. So the same kind of applies to politics here, where it's like, if we look at AOC as the person who is supposed to create the movement that we can all support, maybe it's not that mystifying why she hasn't been able to do that. Because while it's fair to hold her to account for the fact that she promised things pretty close to that, it also is just sort of a flaw in the representative model of government in the first place, which is that you can't necessarily rely on elected officials to start a movement for you. But what AOC can do for the actual left movement, I think, is if the movement is there, whether it's Black Lives Matter or even Palestine, which AOC has been a supporter of, maybe not as vocally or as without hesitance as we may like. But regardless, the point is that she's on the right side of that issue, the correct side of that issue when it comes up. But that issue comes up organically. The movements behind this stuff come up organically. And so that's kind of our responsibility, whether we are Sam Seder or a viewer of Sam Seder or me making this little podcast. It's kind of on us to create the movement behind the things that we want to see get done. And then having people like AOC in power and Rashida Tlaib in power, then they become very useful to us. But we shouldn't be that surprised that they're not that useful when we are not creating much of a movement for them to insist upon in the halls of power. Because if they don't have that leverage that comes with an activated audience that is demanding something, then, the people who are trying to protect the status quo are going to shoo them away. But if they are able to build some real power, if we are able to build some real power behind our messages, then we can start to change some of these conversations. And that's really it's people power. That's what happens when you build an audience or when you organize a large amount of people around the same idea. And so that's what we need to be focusing on. And look, these social media tools, YouTube, TikTok, as long as it exists, whatever it is, they're super useful for that. So, I think as individuals and on as a grassroots level, we need to be focusing on that. Like, how can we use the small amounts of people power that we can accrue here and there to push people like AOC and beyond to, do the things that we want to see. And that's going to look different for the next at least 2 years, probably 4 years or more under Trump and the Republicans. Right? Like, Democrats aren't going to have that much power. So it's even more on us to create momentum behind the things that we want to see, because Democrats can do almost nothing. So it's fair for us to jeer at them and to not respect them for their lack of an ability to create any motion themselves. But at the end of the day, that's not going to get us anywhere. My opinion on AOC is that she's fine. I don't really care. My opinion on, whether Sam Seder gave her a softball interview, he probably did. I don't really care. That's not as important to me as the fact that, is she going to be instrumental in the important moments or not? And I think she probably is, but really that's up to us. And, the last thing I want to mention about all this is Jimmy Dore, during his whole campaign for Force the Vote during the pandemic, I think this was in 2020, Jimmy Dore basically was trying to get the progressives, like AOC, to refuse to vote for Nancy Pelosi for the speakership of the Democrats of the House. And in order to get Nancy Pelosi to bring a vote on Medicare for all to the floor. So basically the idea was for progressives to use their leverage to force Nancy Pelosi to bring Medicare for all to the floor, because the progressives had the power to prevent her from being voted into the speakership. And they didn't end up doing it. There was, I think, a brief kerfuffle, but Nancy Pelosi ended up winning the leadership. No vote was ever forced. And much conversation was had about whether this was a good strategy, whether Jimmy was in good faith, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's pretty clear now that Jimmy Dore is just, in general, as an actor, he's not in good faith. I think he's lost the plot a lot. He talks about a lot of ridiculous things and has grabbed onto a lot of right-wing narratives and won't let go. So without giving Jimmy Dore as an entity too much credit, I want to say that there is something that we should take away from the strategy of Force the Vote. And it's not the ask. The ask was what a lot of people said didn't make that much sense, because forcing Nancy Pelosi to bring a vote for Medicare for all to the floor ultimately wouldn't have done much. The idea was that during COVID, momentum could be built that would, if Nancy Pelosi were to bring it to the floor, best case scenario, it could actually be forced all the way through and go to the Senate. Worst case scenario, we would have a list of people that we could hold accountable for voting against Medicare for all. That was the idea. A lot of people said that was just not worth, it wasn't worth using the political capital that the progressives had at the time to basically get this, what would amount to a symbolic vote. And yes, it would give us a list of names of people who would vote against Medicare for all, but we already have that really in the Democratic Party, so it's not all that useful. But not only does the strategy kind of make sense, the idea of using your leverage to force a vote on something like that, the reason there's something to that strategy, there's two reasons. First of all, Jimmy Dore drew up a strategy. And I don't know who came up with this strategy. I don't think it was his idea, but it was something that he grabbed onto and he talked a lot about it. And this was a very specific strategy. This was something actionable. And then the second thing is that Jimmy Dore used his voice. He screamed and screamed until this strategy was getting a lot of attention. Now, this is pretty much where I break from Jimmy Dore on this particular issue. I think his way of making enough noise that this got attention is also what tanked the idea, because Jimmy Dore is just such a gross misogynist type of person that him raging at AOC just looked terrible. And, strategically it was awful. But I think there's some merit to the fact that this was a specific political ask. It was a demand that progressives used leverage that they did have for an actionable political end. And we can argue about whether that was worth doing at the time, but there's something to the fact that there's something to that method of trying to apply that pressure. And so that's what I sort of want us to think about going forward. As we're trying to figure out what the fuck to do, especially if we're going to try to have any meaningful impact, not just on the Democratic Party, but on politics in general, we're going to have to come up with strategies. We're going to have to come up with strategies that are based on specifics of how all this politics shit works. And we are going to have to try to create the momentum ourselves. That was my point in bringing up the analogy with the music industry, is that you can't go to the establishment, you can't go to the label and say, I want you to create momentum around this idea for me. You've got to create that momentum. And the more momentum you create, the more you can then kick down that door and say, listen, here's what we're doing. And so that's what we should be aiming for. That's the position we should be aiming to put ourselves in, because that is the position that transcends left-right politics or whether or not Democrats are in power. Obviously I'm talking about left-wing positions, stuff like Medicare for all, which I really think is center-left, but the point being that, building our power up such that you create a wave of momentum that is unignorable, that is how we force things through, whether the Democratic Party is in power or not. And that's what we need to focus on. So yeah, AOC is fine. Voting for Democrats is fine. I don't think that we're going to see some third party emerge. If we do, if there's If there's opportunity for that, then I'll support it. Chris Smalls was talking about building up a labor party. I support it. But whether that happens or not, we need to focus on building momentum around specific ideas and specific strategies, actionable demands that we can make of politicians that are going to lead to the ends that we want to see. And building that momentum and that chatter about those ideas ourselves, that is what's going to lead to politicians being forced to do what we want them to do. And that's ultimately what we want to see. There's a lot of catharsis in that. Republicans get a lot of catharsis from getting to see their elected officials forced to do what they want them to do. Whether that's even, sometimes it's not even like what's in their best interest, but they just enjoy seeing Trump take some of these more, weenie elected Republicans and whip them in shape and make them do what he wants. And we do need to see that on the left, but not through a figure like Trump, but through good old-fashioned raw people power. And the only way we're going to do that is by focusing on issues and focusing on specific strategies that we want to see these people do, and not so much whether or not AOC is the ideal politician. She's not, but I do think she's a useful tool, and that is how we should proceed.